The human mind, something so powerful, and yet, as much as we study it, still leaves us with more questions than answers. One of these questions is, why do we remember some things and not others? This question isn't too hard for individuals. Things that mean something to us personally, changed our way of thinking, gave us a feeling we enjoyed. There's a bit more to it than that, but that's the gist. Understanding why individuals remember something isn't all that hard to figure out. After all, it's just one person. You can really get into the mind of one person. But what about people collectively? That's a little harder to do, isn't it? Why is some history remembered and other parts completely forgotten? If I go on Google and search Julius Caesar, I'm going to get millions upon millions of hits. Caesar's a really popular guy. Out of the billions of people who have ever lived, why is he still remembered? I'd imagine it has to do with his life story. It almost resembles a fairy tale, or fiction in general. His life was just remarkable. He started from modest means, worked really hard, became a general, then a politician, a dictator. He rose to unimaginable heights of power. And what makes it so special is that he lost it all in an instant when the Roman Senate infamously stabbed him to death. Even his close friend Brutus joined the conspiracy, a betrayal we still talk about 2,000 years later. We all know this story, but what if we could hear it from the perspective of Brutus? Maybe he would say Caesar lost his mind, was drunk on power, became a complete radical. I would pay good money to hear the story of Caesar as told by Brutus. Unfortunately, Brutus never wrote his story down, so we don't have it. His story is lost to the sands of time. Today, we're going to hear a story that might be just as tragic, maybe more so. The story of a man who was the Brutus to Adolf Hitler. And that's the story of Ernst Hanfstaengl, an early financier, supporter, and comrade of the National Socialist German Workers' Party. A man who was once close friends with Adolf Hitler, who lost his friend because his friend had been so drunk for so long, it changed him as a person completely. But not drunk on alcohol, no. Something else, something much more dangerous. Drunk on an ideology, and despite Hanfstaengl trying to get him to sober up, Hitler never fixed his drinking problem. This would one day consume Hitler's whole life and every single person in his country, and many outside of it. After nearly losing his life in the 1930s, Hanfstaengl defected to the UK. He never stabbed Hitler, but he did play an important part during World War II, providing the Allies with information about Hitler and the Nazi Party. Betrayal. In this episode, we're going to be exploring his memoir, his life story, one that may just live up to the tragedy of Julius Caesar and Brutus. Hello, and welcome to History for Thinkers, a show that brings history to life and makes it easy to understand. In this episode, we are going to be exploring the memoirs of none other than Ernst Hanfstaengl, who was a very early supporter, high-ranking Nazi Party official that eventually defected and went to work for the United States against Hitler. This is such an interesting memoir. I really do encourage you guys to read it for yourselves because there's just so much that I could not include in this episode. Now, before we get into the episode, I want to personally thank Matthew Wyzurek, who recently became a patron over on Patreon. Matthew, thank you so much, man. It means a lot. It really does. Now, if you want to have your name on the big screen and support the show while doing it, you can head on over to patreon.com/historyforthinkers. But that's not all you're going to get, because you're also going to get access to all the postscript episodes. So what are those? Now, that's a little series that I make on the side over for the patrons who are really into these topics. So what I'll do is I'll take like this episode, for example. So we are going to be covering Ernst Hanfstaengl. I'm going to be doing a psychological analysis of Ernst Hanfstaengl himself in a postscript episode. And I do things like that with just about every release that comes out. So if you are really interested in these episodes and you want to go a lot deeper and you want more content, you can head on over to Patreon, support the show, get your name on the big screen, all these great things. So thank you so much to Matthew and anyone else that becomes a patron. And with that out of the way, let's get into the episode. I want to start this episode by talking about why I chose this memoir specifically. Because there are so many different characters and personalities that I could have chosen and done content on, but I think Ernst Hanfstaengl stands out the most to me, probably right after Hitler himself, for a couple of reasons. Now, one of these was that he was an elite long before the Nazi Party was a thing. He was very well connected in the upper echelons of society, and not just German society. So he was, descendant from Bavarian royalty. He had connections to the nobility and whatnot, but he was half American. And he spent a good chunk of his life going back and forth. He was partly raised in Germany, and then as a kid, he later went to America. I mean, the guy went to Harvard. So he just had really big, important connections in both countries. He understood high society in both places very well. And just to give you an understanding of how well connected he was, him and his family, he personally knew both Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He knew Charlie Chaplin, right? The famous movie guy, William Randolph Hearst, the big newspaper guy. I mean, he's regularly name-dropping pretty famous people, to tell you the truth. And it is kind of impressive, but you have to understand why he does it. He's trying to legitimize himself. In fact, he spends the first couple of pages of his memoir talking about, oh yeah, I had, people in my family that were in the American Civil War. I had different Bavarian royal nobility in my family, so on and so forth. He wants people to think that he comes from a legit background. Because generally with Nazis, especially the early on adopters, those people were largely nobodies and lunatics and radicals and rejects. That pretty accurately describes a large portion of the Nazi Party. And he really wants to make a distinction between those people and him. Another thing that really stood out to me about him was that there were a lot of defectors that eventually betrayed the Third Reich and fled and worked for the United States and the Allies. But he stands out to me the most because he was one of the earliest people that was involved in the Nazi Party. I mean, very early on, you could really make the case that if it were not for him, the Nazi Party may not have gotten off the ground. And he's high rank enough in the party that he knows quite a bit. He has a lot of juicy details and spicy stories, and we're going to get into some of the best ones throughout this episode. Now, I do want to have a little disclaimer here. This is what's interesting to me from his memoir. This is a decently length memoir, I think about 300 pages, and I just can't include every little thing inside this episode. It would be too long, right? It would be too much. And at the end of the day, you can go read it yourself if you really want every little detail, which honestly I do encourage you to do. He is one of the few guys that, all right, number one, he speaks English, right? He's half American, so he can actually speak English pretty well. It's not this butchered German translation that sometimes you get, right? I have a very hard time reading Mein Kampf because some of the sentences are just so crazy, right? And that's largely from the translation. Thing number two, he very much resembles a sober person amongst a drunk party. He's in a group of people who are all drunk. And he's the only sober one, and he sees things for what they are. He says it how it is. And I very much like that about him. And it gives him a very unique perspective because really, you have generally two scenarios with people that write about, the Nazi circle. You get someone that's sober, right? Someone that thinks clearly, someone that's not crazy, but they're not very well connected inside the party. And then thing number two, you get someone that is inside the party that eventually writes a memoir or whatever, and, well, you get... it's tainted with their own insanity, right? I mean, because you have to be a little crazy to be wrapped up in this whole thing, right? And I kind of like that about him because, you know what, maybe he did make some mistakes, and maybe he does hide his own personal crazy a little bit, maybe. But I think that he is probably the most sane person that was involved in the Nazi party, at least up at that high level. Something you always have to ask yourself whenever you look into the memoirs or the writings of someone that was involved in such a crazy organization is, can you believe what this person says? Is this man, Ernst Hanfstaengl, telling the truth? I would not blame you if you think that it's exaggerated or he's trying to paint himself in a certain light. I wouldn't blame you if that's your takeaway and your thoughts on it. But personally, I think that we can trust, or at least I do, right? I can't speak for anyone else. Personally, I appreciate what he says, the way he says it. Because very early on, he's got a lot of things going for him playing in his favor. To him being at least a credible person to listen to, right? So one of these things was that a lot of the Nazis viewed him with a lot of suspicion. I mentioned him being like a sober person amongst a crowd of drunken fools, right? And that was definitely bad for him while he was in, the midst of things. People always notice that, oh wow, this guy isn't drinking the same Kool-Aid we are. And that drives a very big wedge between him and Hitler and a whole lot of other party members. Another reason I think he's telling the truth in this memoir is that he's very opinionated, right? He does not pretend to like anyone. Some people he's like, oh yeah, I really like that person. I like that person. That guy thought clearly. And these other people were crazy, right? And he particularly comes out pretty strong against Goebbels, Rosenberg, Hess, Goering, a couple others throughout, but he identifies a lot of these guys as the radicals of the party. The people that really steered Hitler, really away from the good path, where he wanted the party to go, where he thought things should have, could have, would have went, right? And then quite a few times he came close to death. He was nearly killed quite a few times. There were some rumors that during the purges, his name was on the list. He kind of lucked out. He didn't get killed. And then lastly, everything he talks about, everything he describes really does line up with what we know about World War II. Everything from internal Nazi politics and the culture at the time and just the way things went. Everything lines up. There's no big controversy with his memoir. So for all those reasons, I largely believe what he says. And now with that out of the way, I think we can actually get into the memoir itself. So how did Ernst Hanfstaengl see himself? I think that's a really important thing because this is very autobiographical, right? He's writing a memoir. It is his experience, his eyes throughout the Third Reich. And of course, he was a skeptical supporter who wanted to restore order to Germany. That was a very common thing at the time. A lot of people were really upset, and you can't blame them. People who loved Germany. Because things after World War I were terrible. They were, the communists were declaring Soviet socialist republics. The country was in ruin. The politicians, basically capitulated, let France do the whole Treaty of Versailles thing, right? We talked about this so many times now. But, things were just bad. Things were bad, and people like Hanfstaengl wanted order back. And they thought that the Nazis were the people to do that. They were serious. They were very realpolitik about the way they were going about implementing change and bringing back order. And Hanfstaengl, like many other Nazi supporters, kind of had this idea that they would drop the radical, party politics once they got in power, once things got better. Once order was restored, these guys would kind of, drop the whole Nordic race theory thing. They would kind of let go of the anti-Semitism once things were, solidified. As we know, that did not happen. But we have the benefit of knowing history, right? We know how things went. This guy didn't. He was living through it, and for all he knew, things really could have gone a different way. Maybe Hitler didn't become this crazy radical that he eventually became, the dictator that the whole world hated. I very much get that feeling. And that was the hand that Hanfstaengl was dealt. His son later wrote that he spent the rest of his life feeling guilt over the role that he played in this regime. Now, if that had come from anyone other than his son, I probably would be a little skeptical, but because it is his son, I just really do think that he really genuinely felt guilt over the part he played. And personally, my own opinion is, I think he was fundamentally a good person. He had his flaws, right? But I think he was a good person that was at the wrong place. And he got wrapped up in the wrong thing, and he made an honest mistake. I think if you kind of look at it like that, I think you can really understand his plight. Now, generally, the theme of this whole book is he very much portrays himself as that sober, sane person inside the party, and I do very much get that feeling. Like, he knew that, and he kind of hammers that point home, and he makes sure you know it. But his opinion was largely reasonable and balanced. Again, he had that American perspective. He wasn't like an only German thinker, right? He didn't have a one-track mind. Everyone else in the party pretty much did. No one else had a connection to anywhere outside of Germany. And he was largely influenced by American society. He very much urged Hitler time and time again, learn English, go to America. I mean, right when he got out of prison after that first big coup, he was like, listen, man, go travel, see the world, get a view of Germany from outside of Germany. You'll see things completely differently. Of course, Hitler never did it. He never listened. So he never did get that, perspective of the world that Hanfstaengl did. And, well, maybe that was one of the things that played a role in the demise of the party. Who knows? Maybe, maybe not. But gradually, as the story goes on, Hanfstaengl lost control of Hitler. Because Hitler would much rather listen to the party radicals, right? A lot of the people that Hanfstaengl personally disliked, especially Alfred Rosenberg. Rosenberg was the big ideologue in the party. He was the one that pushed the whole Nordic race theory. And we'll talk more about that, but it really is crazy. And one of the things I thought was oddly symbolic on the cover of the book, actually, was that there's a picture of Hitler reading a newspaper looking away from Hanfstaengl. It's almost symbolic of his influence over Hitler and trying to be a voice of reason. And how Hitler just doesn't want to listen to reason. He wants to listen to the radicals, the crazy people in the party. So after World War I, he was living in Germany again, and he had a friend, an old Harvard friend, who worked at the U.S. Embassy in Germany, and he asked Hanfstaengl to attend a Nazi party rally and report his impressions. So, pretty straightforward. So he goes, and he was fascinated by Hitler's speaking ability. And just every account that I read, it's always like this. It's always, oh yeah, I thought I was just going to go see what they had to say, and then I heard Hitler speak, and then I was a Nazi for the next 40 years of my life. Like that's always how it goes. It's just fascinating. And Hanfstaengl was particularly fascinated by Hitler's speaking ability. He even wrote quote, "What Hitler was able to do to a crowd in 2.5 hours will never be repeated in 10,000 years." He continued, "Because of his miraculous throat construction, he was able to create a rhapsody of hysteria. In time, he became the living unknown soldier of Germany." So if that is not a glowing praise of Hitler's ability to speak, I don't know what is. I think part of the reason that Hanfstaengl later in his life, long after World War II was over, part of the reason he felt so much guilt at that time was because he had a feeling that if it had not been for him, the Nazi Party never would have got off the ground. And I do think that could definitely be the case. Like I mentioned, he was one of the few people that came from like the upper echelons of society to the Nazi Party, because it was largely, a bunch of nobodies and clowns and jokers, right? Street thugs, more or less. And his involvement early on was as a party financier. So if it wasn't for him, Mein Kampf never gets published. If it wasn't for him, their Nazi daily newspaper, the Volkischer Beobachter, never comes out, never gets printed. So that plays a really, really big role. And even early on, he's pretty honest about it. He says, quote, "I simply have no clear idea where the party revenues came from." So he just had, even him as someone that was a big supporter of the party financially, he's putting all this money into it. Again, he's one of the few upper echelon elites that is part of the party, and they're already keeping him in the dark. So that's kind of telling of things to come. And really the way they raised revenue early on, right? Because the party didn't have a lot of money. It was a bunch of, basically World War I veterans coming together trying to make something of this far-right radical thing. And well, their first attempts to raise money all miserably failed. But Hanfstaengl came in, and then he introduced them to the higher society, at least in Bavaria at first. And like I said, Hanfstaengl was Bavarian nobility, or descended from it at least. So he had kind of like this really strong air of legitimacy along with the Nazi Party. And that is how Hitler got introduced to a whole bunch of big business people, big names in Germany, old money, those kinds of people. And, I really do wonder if Hanfstaengl wasn't there to legitimize the party, maybe that funding never comes. So this is why I find the memoir so fascinating. It's a big historical what if this guy doesn't get involved. What happens? Because I'll tell you, I don't think the Nazi Party gets off the ground without him. Something I really loved about this memoir was that he would interject some of these interesting little stories here and there. Things that really could have changed history if they had happened another way. And one of these was how Hitler was nearly killed by communists. So they were driving to see a businessman in Berlin, trying to secure funding, and they had to go through the state of Saxony. So that's about in like central Germany, and they had to drive through it, but here was the problem. Saxony was under communist control. So it's a really big risk to be driving through there, because by this time, right, this is after Hitler is out of prison, he's kind of a big name, people know who he is. So by driving through Saxony under communist control, it's kind of like, well, if they identify you, man, you're dead. There goes your head, right? And eventually they get stopped by communist guards. And I cannot imagine how fast Hitler's heart was pumping. He must have been scared out of his mind. And they asked to see documents. Now, Hanfstaengl managed to swoop in and save the day. Basically saves Hitler's life. So he speaks in this thick German-American accent and claims to be a paper manufacturer. So they bought it. They didn't even ask to see Hitler's paper. So that's one of those little stories that is just crazy. Right? They eventually got to Berlin. I don't know if they secured the funding or not. He didn't say, but Such an interesting little story. And I think something like this always illustrates really well how chaotic things really were in Germany at this time. And I always try to imagine the American equivalent example, right? So let's say you're a Californian, you have, this upstart political party, but you need to go all the way to Seattle, Washington, to secure some funding. But you got to drive through Oregon to get there, and Oregon is controlled by communists. So you kind of risk your life by driving through there. I mean, how destabilizing a thing would that be? I mean, if not just for, your literal safety and whatnot, but also just, the psychological factor, right? Oh, there are communists right over there. One state over. That's kind of how it was. There were actually quite a few places that became Soviet socialist republics in Germany. So I think that really explains why people didn't willingly embrace Hitler. It was kind of like a really reluctant, okay, get rid of these communists and, we'll give you power kind of situation like that. Hanfstaengl claims that Hitler disliked horses because Hitler was allergic to horses. And for that reason, he abolished horses in the Wehrmacht during World War II, which was very much against the wishes of the German generals. So, it really is fascinating because I've never heard about that before outside of this memoir. So I really wonder, was Hitler that spiteful enough, that much of a clown to, get rid of something that really could have made a big difference in the military? Who knows? It could have been the big, the determining factor in World War II. Who knows how the Battle of Stalingrad goes if you add in horses on the German side? We don't know. But I really do think that Hitler probably was, crazy enough to get rid of horses, even though they're useful, because he personally dislikes them. Absolutely within the realm of possibility. Something that's always been a real frustration with history is that we don't know how people felt at different times, when events take place and, the direction things are going. If someone doesn't say it and then someone else writes it down, we just don't know. That what they say, gone into the wind. It's gone forever. We'll never know. One of these really interesting examples is when sometimes Hanfstaengl will record some of the thoughts, the murmurings inside the party. People's thoughts on how things are going, Hitler, the direction Hitler is taking the party, what he's doing, how he's doing it. Some of the most fascinating material throughout this book. One of these times, Eckart, who's a big writer in the Nazi party, a Volkisch German nationalist, he complains about the party. He complains about the direction Hitler is taking it, and he says, quote, "I tell you I am fed up with this toy soldier stuff of Hitler's. Heaven knows the Jews are behaving badly enough in Berlin, and the Bolsheviks are an even worse lot. But you cannot build a political party on the basis of prejudices alone. I am a writer and a poet, and I am too old to go along with him anymore." I don't believe he ever truly breaks from the Nazi party, but the fact that he felt this way, probably not very surprising. I think it's very telling. Now, something that I found very funny was that in, Hitler and Hanfstaengl, they talk about America from time to time. Hanfstaengl is always pushing, learn more about America. Let's get better and closer relations with America because, they're the future. He saw it even back then, that they were going to be the economy of the world, really. And then there's this point where Hitler hears about the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. And he literally asks Hanfstaengl if there is a way that they can reach out and make some kind of connection, form an alliance. And, and it was at that point that Hanfstaengl was like, he does not understand how it is in America. You would think, I guess Hitler was under the impression that it's some big political organization when it was really just a bunch of, angry racists putting on a bunch of, their sheets, running around and terrorizing people. Not a legitimate political organization. Nice try though, Hitler. Now, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever gone back and you've read something like a memoir or a primary historical source or general historical works in general, and you realize that you don't know nearly half as much as you thought you did about this event, these people, whatever regime, whatever it is? It is always so humbling because you realize that so much of what you thought you knew was just this general public perception that we all kind of get sucked into, right? We don't all have the time and energy and the willpower to sit around and really read every single historical work and familiarize ourselves with every government and regime, and we just don't have time for that. So it's kind of a shortcut, if you will. We all kind of need them, right? We can't all be historians all the time, right? I mean, it would just be useless after a certain point. But you realize that so much of what you thought you knew is just straight up wrong, or maybe generally a misconception. Now, I discovered one of my own going through this whole thing, and it is extremely humbling for me because I'm someone who spent a lot of time reading, researching, and talking about World War II and the Nazis specifically. I think I've got 2 podcast episodes, deep biography dives, deep dives on big Nazi names, right? I did Hitler, Joseph Goebbels. I've spent a lot of time I've got a whole bunch of Nazi videos on this channel, and I read this memoir and completely had a big idea, a big general perception that I had of this Nazi regime completely shattered. Completely shattered. So what was that general perception? I think this is one a lot of us have. And it's that the Nazi government was generally this really powerful, stable, maybe stable isn't the right word, but the idea that it was almost robotic, right? I've heard that analogy used a lot, that the Nazis were like robots. And they operated with extreme efficiency, and there was no chaos on the inside. I mean, it was very authoritarian, very scary, and dominant, and it overwhelmed every aspect of your life. But it did so efficiently. And that's something that I realize is just not true. At least, like I said, if we're going to believe Ernst Hanfstaengl and his whole take on things, he kind of pulled back the curtain on this one. Because there was so much inter-party rivalry and bickering and I mean just some of the individuals and not low-ranking people either, people that were big names in the Nazi party. Some of these guys were just absolutely insane. You really can't find another word for it. And Ernst Hanfstaengl does a really good job of giving his own public opinions, his own thoughts on things, right? He doesn't hold anything back. Yeah, at least I don't think, But one of these things that he talks a lot about is, some of the problems with the party and then some of the radicals, right? We've kind of hit on that point. The radicals were steering the party, and specifically how Hitler thought about the world. These crazy guys in the party were pushing Hitler more into the side of the extreme and kind of taking him away from reality. One of these guys was Alfred Rosenberg. Hanfstaengl makes it very clear that he hates Rosenberg. Because Rosenberg, well, he's an interesting fellow. I'm just going to read you a short paragraph from this memoir, and I think it gives you a really good idea of the kind of person Alfred Rosenberg was. Quote, Rosenberg was such an unappetizing fellow. He had only recently married, but his colleagues on the paper recounted innumerable stories about his unsavory love life, which usually involved multiple intercourse with half a dozen men and women companions at a time in some grubby backstreet flat. It must have been the Tartar in him. In dress, he had the taste of a costermonger's donkey, and on this occasion, I remember very well, he was wearing a violet shirt with a scarlet tie, with a brown waistcoat and blue suit. He had some theory about it being a waste of money to wash shirts, and used to throw them away when they became unwearable, even by his standards. That is such... I'll tell you, I found this paragraph here hilarious the first time I read it. And then I read it again. I thought a little bit more about it. What a vermin this guy was, this Rosenberg. I mean, how disgusting of a human being. And I realized I don't know very much about him either, as an individual. Right? You can't know everything about every single individual human, right? But I always just associated Rosenberg with the fact that he was half Jewish and he was one of these really big proponents of anti-Semitism. Lo and behold, there's quite a couple other nasty things about him. And now, like I mentioned earlier, Rosenberg was one of the craziest people in the party. And his claim to fame was the whole Nordic race theory. And that was this pseudo-scientific idea, because it was not based on science. This pseudo-scientific idea that the Nordic race, right, the Vikings, the Northern Germanic peoples, they are the true superior race, and they're better, and they're smarter on average and stronger on average, and all these kinds of things, right? Our civilization is the most advanced. We've always been conquerors. Now, this is not just a very European-centric way of viewing the world, but it's just completely wrong, right? Anyone who studies history honestly can look back and say, it's not one race or one people group that dominates at any given time. I remember, I don't know where I read this, but I really loved it, so I'm going to use it here. There was this idea that there is a flame of civilization and innovation, and it gets passed around, right? It doesn't stay with one people group, and in some places, you get something like the Roman Empire. They had that flame for a long time, but the flame went out. Go somewhere else. The Romans, for whatever reason, they just couldn't keep kindling the fire, and it just moves on. And this has just always been the way history has happened. So, I think that people during this time, or like during the World War II era, I understand why they could think something as crazy as this, because when you read older histories and whatnot, it is very abstract, but with this whole Nordic race theory, it only really stands the test of time if you measure all of human history in like the last couple hundred years, right? Maybe the last 200 years. That's about it. I think Hanfstaengl really took issue with a theory like this, because, anyone that is not drunk on the Kool-Aid of Nazism can kind of see it for what it is. It is a lunatic conspiracy theory that, it's pretty nuts. And there's a lot that Hanfstaengl says about Rosenberg, a whole lot. I've just taken out the really good bits. So there was one point when Hanfstaengl was trying to get Rosenberg out of the party. He's trying to say to Hitler, listen man, kick this guy out. He's bad news. He's crazy. All these kinds of things. And then he showed Hitler an article that Rosenberg had written. It had 14 grammatical errors. And of course, the article was about his whole Nordic race theory. The Germans are the master race, stuff along those lines. And then Hitler responded to Hanfstaengl and said that this might be influential philosophy in 50 years. It is so crazy how your own little ideology and being inside of an echo chamber like this can really warp your perception of reality and philosophy. 50 years, people might really believe this stuff. No, they don't. I'm from the future. They don't believe it. They debunked it. And then Hanfstaengl responded to Hitler, this whole it could be influential philosophy one day, and he says this, quote, "If you fold a piece of paper over an ink blot, no one is going to mistake it in 50 years for a Rembrandt. Rosenberg is a dangerous and stupid man, and the sooner you get rid of him, the better." He really pushed quite a few times to get rid of this Rosenberg guy. It's just too bad, because I really, really wonder what would have happened if there weren't these radicals inside this Nazi party. What if Hitler, instead of being influenced by the nut jobs in the party, actually did something better with it, right? I mean, of course it was kind of far right from the beginning, and you just can't deny that. But it didn't have to continue in that direction. There didn't have to be the party purges and all the other, the Holocaust, all the crazy things that went on, because these people, their philosophy and the way they thought and viewed the world was just not connected with reality in any way. What would have happened if they weren't that crazy? Big what if, big missed opportunity there. Now, throughout this entire memoir, he talks quite a bit about Hitler's psychology. He doesn't go too in-depth on it at any given point. I'm sure he was kind of sick of it. I know that's what he worked on when he defected and started working for the US government. So after that entire thing, he was probably sick of talking about Hitler's psychology, right? Yeah, refer to my previous work, right? But he does have some, he mentions a few things that he thinks played a part in the psychology of Hitler. So he thinks that Hitler could not have sex. And that was why Hitler never really had a woman for all those years, and he just never connected with them. He did have girlfriends from time to time, but he never really stayed with them, right? And there are numerous murmurings and, friends of friends, and people say this and that, the word on the street, right? And he mentions quite a few of those examples throughout the entire thing. One of them, interestingly enough, being Eva Braun, right? Years later, we're fast forwarding. Years later, Eva Braun has nothing from him as a man. Those are her exact words. Nothing from him as a man. I think that there is a very good chance that Hanfstaengl was right. And that this inability to have sex was the thing that drove him for worldly success. Because he knew he wasn't going to be able to have kids, he wasn't going to be able to have a legacy, pass on his genes, never going to happen. And so he took all of his sexual energy, the libido, and he turned it into energy in other parts of his life, right? Particularly his speaking. And that was how he got off, in a way. It was the only real good thing going for him, right? Could you imagine not being able to have sex? That would be terrible. Terrible. It's always really difficult to accept that you've made a terrible mistake, especially when you're really far gone, really into it, really invested. It can be tough to admit defeat, give up, and move on. Very few people are capable of doing just that, because it's tough. Now, Hanfstaengl really spins this narrative, and it is kind of a narrative, right? But I do think that there is some truth to it, that he had a decent amount of influence on Hitler in the early days, right? Hitler and the Nazis were generally indebted to Hanfstaengl. Without him, the party probably wouldn't have gotten off the ground. But that influence that he had with Hitler and in the party generally gradually declined as the years went on, and people like Rosenberg kept polluting Hitler's mind with the Nordic race theory and anti-Semitism and all the other radical ideas that got passed around. And it must have been really tough. Because I just imagine how much energy that Hanfstaengl personally put into this party. The dude put up a lot of his own money. When he was funding Mein Kampf, it wasn't from, a business or something. I mean, this was his own money, right? And during the craziest time in German history, he's living there, there's inflation, there's all the other crazy things going on at the time, and he's dishing out cash so these guys can try to fix the system, right? Or at least so Hanfstaengl thought. That's what he thought was going to happen. And it just must have been such a sad realization that, oh yeah, I've invested years of my life, God only knows how much money, hundreds of hours and energy and effort, time, and I'm not going to get anything back. In fact, if I get out of this regime alive, I'm going to be lucky under those circumstances. And that's a pretty tough realization to go through. And you really get a good sense of Hitler's mania with this one little story here. So he was, according to Hanfstaengl, Hitler was completely manic by the 30s. Once you get to that point, he already had this messiah complex. He thought he was God. He thought he was the second coming of Christ. All this crazy shit. I mean, so nuts. And so there's this one point where Hanfstaengl organizes for there to be a photographer from the New York Times taking a picture of Hitler during an interview. Now, Hitler doesn't know that the photographer is focusing more on him, but Hanfstaengl kind of wanted to have these normal-looking pictures of Hitler, because all the other pictures that Hitler liked were all these crazy evil dictator pictures. I mean, it really fed into this perception. I mean, I got one here. I'm sorry if you're listening to the podcast, you can't see, but I'm sure you've seen it before. Just Hitler holding up his fist, screaming at the top of his lungs. I mean, just typical crazy tyrant stuff. And that's how he wanted to be seen. That is what his public persona was. And of course, that doesn't play very good in global politics. They see, the British, the French, the Russians, they see all these crazy dictator pictures of Hitler and they're like, oh my God, I do not want to deal with this guy. let's build a wall. Let's increase the size of the army. And Hanfstaengl got these pictures, normal looking pictures that wouldn't scare everyone away. And then Hitler hated them. He said, oh, I don't look like that. That's not me. That's not what I look like. So it's just fascinating that he really went out of his way to give off the dictator impression. So by the time that Hitler is taking political office, becoming the chancellor, the Nazis are establishing themselves as the government, he uses his inner circle of these really psychologically ill men in such a nefarious way. And Hanfstaengl makes note of this, how unusual the relationship dynamic was. Because, for one, Hitler kept his entourage, right, his cabinet, competing with one another. So they were all fighting to outdo one another at all times. Always pushing and trying to, to be the good Nazi, right? Trying to fight the good fight. And it was a constant struggle. And one of the weirder things that Hitler did was have individual meetings instead of big cabinet meetings. So generally, a politician, especially when they're high up, they're in high office, they'll have a big meeting, they'll have everyone in their cabinet, right? Sometimes anywhere between 10, 20 people or so. And these are your people, the guys or gals that you trust, who have really good expertise and good judgment on this and that topic. And they are there to inform you and to play a role on a team. Hitler didn't do that. Hitler wasn't playing that game. Hitler wanted to only have individual meetings. And that way he could say one thing to one person, say another thing to another person, and then he was able to play them off each other even more, because all these different government positions that he eventually created himself, they had overlapping responsibilities. So you could have, let's say Joseph Goebbels and Hermann Göring. And there is going to be overlap between what their jobs do. And that is going to be a point of contention. They're going to fight, they're going to battle, there's going to be a clash, and then they're going to go to Hitler. And then Hitler is just going to use it to exploit them even more. Now, I think this is the real reason that Hitler preferred these messed up guys in his party, right? Because if you look at any individual person that was really high up, now, some otherwise sane people did join the party later on, but I think most of them did it because they were scared of being killed, not because they actually believed in the tenets of Nazism. So with that disclaimer, most of these early guys, right, people like Goebbels, Rosenberg, Göring, Hess, a lot of these guys were psychologically ill, right? They had mental illness. There isn't really another way to put it. You really have to wonder, was Hitler crazy and manipulative, or was he a genius? Or is he some combination of both? Because he did all this intentionally. He didn't just, oh wow, what do you know? It just so happens that every single person that I've surrounded myself with is mentally ill. That's not a coincidence. I think that's also why Hanfstaengl stood out like a sore thumb. He was the voice of reason in a lot of times, and people didn't want to hear that after a while. If morality comes into it, I cannot imagine that Hitler did these guys any kind of justice. Maybe this is the most that any of these guys could have amounted to in their lives. You know, you always have to think something like that. But I can't imagine that they were happy even when they were at the peak of power. I mean, Joseph Goebbels, I mean, we'll get into some stuff on him, but I just can't imagine him as an individual was happy regardless of how much progress the Nazi party made, how many votes they got, how much approval they got. Didn't matter. This was not going to make any of these men happy. Now, one of the sneakier things that Hitler did was, right, so he flipped the old saying. I mean, there's that old saying, right? Praise in public, criticize in private. It's pretty straightforward. You don't want to step on anyone's ego, but you also want to provide a way to give people feedback when they've messed up. Hitler flipped this idea on its head, and he would publicly criticize people. So he would go out of his way to step on someone's ego, hit them right where it hurts. Joseph Goebbels, you're an idiot. And then he would get them in private and say, oh, I really like you've done this. Oh, you've done a lot with the SS over here. Good job, Himmler. But he wouldn't do it in public. And that, you know, Hitler, this is why I really do think that he was very emotionally intelligent. Because when you got someone that, as evil as it is, as terrible as it was for all the people involved, right, in and outside of his cabinet, I just cannot imagine anyone being able to do this and pull this off without having extremely high emotional intelligence. Extremely high. Another thing Hanfstaengl makes note of is that Hitler just straight up lied through his teeth. Now, there was a speech that he was giving at one point, and I think this was before the Third Reich was solidified, so somewhere in the early 30s. And he said that the Third Reich would not subject anyone to their will, right? And he didn't want to repeat German imperialism, more or less, right? The problems with the Holy Roman Empire and you know, expanding too far, not being able to control it, internal division, conflict, all that kind of stuff. And people loved it. People ate it up. This is what they wanted to hear. These are the policies that they wanted. But Hitler didn't mean it. Hitler knew full well that the second that he had the chance, he was going to do what he was going to do. He was going to take more land, invade more countries, kill more people, and that was going to be that. And I can only imagine that it was so frustrating for so many different people that supported this party because, well, the Nazi party before they became the government and after are two different governments, two very different political parties. Hitler did a lot of work to incorporate elements from socialism and Völkisch nationalism and German conservatism and all these different ideas. He incorporated elements from just about every, anywhere on the political spectrum, took the best parts of it and then put it in the party, right? That was what he did. He grew those numbers, grew the membership, grew the party. And as a result, the Nazi Party was kind of internally divided. There was a left-leaning faction in there, the people that were just more, oh hey, Nazism is pretty cool, but let's make sure that the working class is doing okay. Let's make sure that we have some of the socialist elements in National Socialism. People that thought that way. And then they got control of the government, and then Hitler killed all those people. Right? Most notably, the Strasser brothers, they were kind of the leaders of the left-leaning faction within the party, and, well, one of them got killed, the other got exiled, and the party went right back to its far-right, insane, crazy roots. And people like Rosenberg became more representative of what the party was by then. And like I've said quite a few times throughout this episode, what really fascinates me is these little stories here and there that you just otherwise wouldn't hear about. For example, the Churchill Incident. So there was one point when Hitler was on the campaign trail. He was, really trying to grow the numbers, grow the party, get votes. And Churchill, who was he was a big name in Britain, but I think he was an opposition leader, not prime minister yet. So he wasn't calling the shots, but he was with his family in a hotel nearby Hitler and his entourage, his crew. And he had invited Hitler through Hanfstaengl to come on over so they could talk, so they can discuss politics, the relations between the two countries. And Hanfstaengl, he realized what a big deal this would be. Because, this could literally change the course of history for Germany as they knew it at the time. Could have been a big deal. And Hitler didn't want to come. Hanfstaengl goes back. He finds Hitler. He's like, listen, man, come on. We gotta go. Churchill is over there. Let's go make a friend. Let's form an alliance here. Hitler didn't want to go. And Hanfstaengl later went back. He said that, he gave some excuse. Hitler was busy or whatever. And he just kind of had to fill in. And one of these ambassadors who was at this little event told Hanfstaengl that England wanted to consider forming an alliance with Germany because they kind of recognized that Germany was going to be a big player in the coming days, right? In the coming years. So this is just one big failure, right? A big historical what if. If Hitler had gone to this, we don't really know what would have happened with any certainty, right? But there were British politicians, big names. Winston Churchill. And they are over there looking to form an alliance, basically invite Germany into the big boys club. But Hitler didn't want to go. And you might wonder, why didn't he want to go? Well, Hanfstaengl believes that Hitler was too insecure to meet with someone that could be seen as an equal, or a superior even. So, Churchill was a very big personality at the time. He was probably one of the few people in the world at that point that really could have given Hitler this feeling of insecurity, of, being less than. Because otherwise, right, like we've already kind of talked about Hitler's entourage, his inner circle, he wanted to surround himself with broken people. So when it came to meeting with someone like Hitler, or even Mussolini, we're going to talk about later, he was very resistant to meeting with Mussolini. He didn't want to meet with anyone that could be on the same level as he was. And this is the point in the party where they start using these Nietzschean phrases. They really start, I wouldn't say using, I would say co-opting, maybe subverting even, Nietzsche's philosophy. Most famously, the Übermensch. So Friedrich Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch is the idea of the higher man, the self-actualized being who doesn't need religion, who doesn't need anyone else's dogma, who creates his own values, his own moral compass, his entire own way of viewing the world. And this was one of Nietzsche's most famous ideas. But the Nazis started using Übermensch, and they just started saying that they were the Übermensch. So, and that's interesting because Nietzsche even wrote that the Übermensch does not yet exist. It's more of an ideal to be strived for. But the Nazis basically said that, yeah, we are the super people. Yeah, another word they used is das Ehrenvolk, right? The superior race, right? The master race. And then they even co-opted, so they took Übermensch, the higher man, and then they flipped it too for as an insult to other people, and they invented the word Untermensch. So Unter is German for under or below, and when you say Untermensch, it is basically subhuman, right? That's what it more or less translates to. So Übermensch is the higher man, the higher value, the Superman, and then there's the Untermensch, everyone else. And I just cannot imagine what nut jobs these guys were. I mean, just, could you imagine actually saying stuff like this and meaning it and really thinking it? I mean, you go out, Joseph Goebbels goes out he's on his radio propaganda, and he gives a speech and he says, "We are the Übermensch. Everyone else is an Untermensch. Therefore, we should kill them and take their stuff." I mean, that's a gross oversimplification, but I mean, that's more or less what he was saying. It was more or less their philosophy. And you can't help but draw a big distinction between this philosophy and the actual writings of Friedrich Nietzsche. Two completely different worlds. And now, it's in the 1930s now, when the Nazis are taking power. I'm sorry we skip around a little bit. I didn't want to necessarily follow the 100% chronological day by day. I think that gets a little boring. But a couple years later now, after they are in power, the Nazis started passing these draconian laws, the ones that they are so infamous for. So they are taking away freedom of speech, they are taking away civil liberties, they are really just clamping down on freedom in Germany. Now, Hanfstaengl, he was like very many other people. There were a lot of people who were on board with the whole Nazi party, but then, well, they started doing this stuff, and then they just kind of hoped that it was a temporary fix to some of the problems, right? And, well, like most temporary fixes, they weren't going to be going away anytime soon. Whenever there is a big or maybe not world-changing, a big country-changing policy that gets pushed, and it's always dressed up as, oh, this is a temporary measure, we're going to take it off the books the second we don't need it anymore. It's always a lie. Always a lie. The people that pass these laws, they know full well that this law is going to stay in place, and that's just going to be how things are in the future. I mean, in America, off the top of my head, there's the Federal Reserve thing, the income tax thing, the coming off the gold standard thing. All these laws were supposed to go away after a while. We were supposed to revert back to the way it was before at some undetermined point. But of course, that's never how it goes. Never does. And Hitler did exactly the same thing in Germany. And Hanfstaengl notes that there were a lot of these other guys that were in the party, that were supporters, and they really hoped that this was like a temporary thing. They just kind of looked the other way because, well, guess what? Now that you live in a Nazi dictatorship, there isn't a whole lot that you can do to stop it. And that's why it was so dangerous. And what I found interesting was that Hanfstaengl, being one of the more sober people in the party, right? He wasn't drunk on the ideology like a lot of the other guys were. And despite him being a big-time insider, a personal friend of Hitler, someone that literally funded the party in the early days, financed Mein Kampf, he was finding out about a lot of these draconian laws in the newspaper. I mean, just imagine how terrible that would feel. You are a high-ranking person inside this party from basically day one. And you are finding out about, now that it has power, you're finding out about the laws that are getting passed in the newspaper. That must have been such a big slap in the face. Very disrespectful, but Hanfstaengl notes that he wasn't the only one that was finding out this way, although I have a feeling that he probably wouldn't have been the first to be included. And this is the point where he comes to the sinister realization that these Nazis, these National Socialists, these sociopaths, these guys actually believe their crazy little slogans. Now, the thing about politics, especially democratic systems, it's really difficult to manage expectations because on the one side, you need to convince people that your policy, your positions are going to be good. And in order for them to think that they are good, you need to be able to put it in a really catchy way, a way that it's really simple, that anyone can understand, that you can just kind of plaster all over the place. And then they're going to support you, they're going to understand it, they're going to like it, and they're going to jump on board. You're going to get voted in power, and everybody wins. That's how it's supposed to go. But the problem with that is it's so difficult, I would say impossible, to actually simplify every single political position you have into a sentence or two, right? I mean, if you and your entire worldview, your political outlook, can be summed up in one sentence, what does that say about your political outlook? And that is the scary part about the Nazis actually believing their own propaganda. Again, they were drunk on the Kool-Aid. This oversimplified, propagandistic little slogans and catchphrases. They actually believed it. And then things like this started happening a little bit too frequently. So there was a point when Hanfstaengl was told by another member of the party that there was a private prison being used to torture people. I mean, literally taking political prisoners, torturing them, doing all kinds of horrible stuff. So he went out and he asked Hermann Göring about it, right? Because by this point, Göring's a big name in the party. Of course, Göring lied and denied what you do. And this isn't to like some random journalist. This isn't lies to some random person on the streets. This is lying to someone that is a fellow comrade in your party, a high-ranking official. You're gonna lie to them. That is who Göring lied to. And then he asked, Hanfstaengl, where did you hear about this? Who told you about this? And then Hanfstaengl was kind of reluctant to tell the name, right? Because I think even by this point, he kind of understood what this regime was. But he got the promise that no harm would come this person's way, so he gave Göring the name. And then this other guy, the guy that told Hanfstaengl, was literally detained in prison for weeks, nearly killed. If it wasn't for Hanfstaengl intervening in getting him out, he may not have gotten out. So at this point, early 1930s, it's already pretty far gone. I remember a long time ago reading a theory on Hitler and his anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, generally on that whole topic. And I found that the theory so fascinating, I wasn't quite sure what to make of it. But the theory went something like this, that Hitler had no real intention of doing the Holocaust, of actually killing all the Jews. He didn't actually want to exterminate them. He only wanted to use them as leverage because, according to his ideology, his worldview, the Jews control the world, right? Let's not forget that the Nazis more or less thought that Jews controlled the entire planet. You know, every nation from the UK to the United States, Russia, Soviet Union at the time. They controlled everything. So when the writing was on the wall and people kind of started to see that, oh, hey, I'm Jewish, and the Nazis just came to power. Maybe it's time for me to leave. They kind of made it more difficult for the Jews to leave. They actually stood in the way. They didn't want them to go, not because they necessarily wanted to kill them, but because they wanted to keep them as leverage. And that this whole theory kind of ties in with this little story from Hanfstaengl's Memoir. So he talks about this Jewish lawyer from New York named Maxie Steuer who wanted to fund Jewish trips back to America. So, Jews have had a history of migration, right? So it was just kind of like a no-brainer. When one country gets too anti-Semitic or, they have some kind of problem with you for whatever reason, you just leave, right? That's just kind of how it goes. Or, you risk whatever else happening to you, right? So Hanfstaengl thought this was a pretty good idea, right? After all, he was a Nazi, he was an anti-Semite. Let's acknowledge that. And he went to ask Hitler about it, and he was like, well, getting rid of them is better than killing them, right? So he figured that Hitler would go for it, but Hitler actually said no, and he said this, quote, "We need the Jews as hostages." And this little story kind of sheds a little bit of legitimacy on that whole theory, that Hitler wanted to not let the Jews leave, but use them as leverage or as hostages later on. And what's even scarier is that despite being this monster, really, could you imagine using men, women, and children, and families as hostages or leverage in your country for geopolitical maneuverings, right? Just what an evil thing to do. And what's even scarier is that he was not universally recognized as evil at the time. This is the part of history that people don't really talk about that much. The way World War II is generally portrayed is that, Hitler came to power and he was evil and everyone knew he was evil, and then we all teamed up and we stopped him, and that was the end of that. That's not how it went. There were a lot of people in high society, in Western nations, people with big names that you probably heard about that knew Hitler, or they were friends with Hitler, or they had some kind of connection with him or the Nazi Party generally. Just to name a few people here, we have Henry Ford, the big automobile guy, Charles Lindbergh, Lloyd George. These guys were all admirers or friends of Hitler. And Lloyd George was even scarier because he was a big-time British politician at the time. He even signed a photo to Hitler and, he wrote on it, "To Chancellor Hitler, in admiration of his courage, determination, and leadership." And that's a little scary when you think about it. There were a lot of people, even though they weren't drunk on the Kool-Aid, they weren't drunk on the ideology, they were admirers from afar. And I almost see that as, it's morally, I don't know what to say about it, right? But I think it kind of does show that Hitler was really as good at propaganda as they say he was. And I think a lot of this was, especially with Lloyd George, because he wanted what was best for the UK, not necessarily anyone else. He saw Hitler as leading the new world superpower. And he was not the only person in the British Empire that felt this way. If World War II wouldn't have happened, there's a good chance that Germany, with or without Hitler, becomes the next world superpower. And now we get to the point in the memoir where it is around 1933, the point where Hanfstaengl says that he completely lost Hitler to fanaticism. He's completely lost him. He's all about his own ego, his God complex, and this really strong self-perception that Hitler had. The idea that he is more or less the second coming of Christ. And there was one point when Hitler gave a speech and he says this, quote, "The state is the party and the party is the state." And I think when he claimed that in 1933, that was a very big deal because it was true. There are a lot of people that say very out there things that aren't really completely true, or maybe there's a grain of truth to them. Now, by this point, Hitler completely controlled the state. I mean, he controlled the party controlled the state, and by extension, I mean, they controlled everything. So, Hanfstaengl notes that this is when Hitler stops trying to win people over. He is no longer worried about convincing people about his plan or the party program. We already discussed a little bit how, the different policies in the National Socialist Party, sometimes they would emphasize the socialist thing, sometimes they would emphasize the nationalist thing. And he stopped doing that. He didn't care about it anymore. He was just basically like, yeah, we're going to revert back to like what we really are, which is this crazy military dictatorship, let's invade the world political party. That's what they really were. He just continued preaching to the converted, really. And he actually used that word converted, which again hits on that whole idea of Nazism being a religion. So by this point, Hitler is just completely lost. Hanfstaengl has basically no influence over him, and Hitler's connection to reality is just gone. He's living in this fantasy Nazi religion world, and his ego actually gets so big. I mean, he is so lost to the fanaticism that he literally critiques and complains about some of Germany's greatest leaders. I mean, people like Frederick the Great, people like Otto von Bismarck, who were originally big inspirations, but Hitler saw himself as better than some of them. I mean, he even criticized Bismarck. This is actually what he says, quote, "Old Bismarck simply had no idea how to deal with the Jewish problem. Of course, he should have just killed them. No duh. I mean, come on, Bismarck. Get with the times." So that's quite a bit of pretty intense stuff right there. I mean, we had the whole Holocaust, what was going on with the Jews being used as hostages, Hitler's crazy ego, the criticizing old leaders of Germany. I mean, literally putting Bismarck down. Pretty crazy stuff. Pretty intense. I think it's time to talk about something a little more lighthearted, a little funnier, maybe a little interesting too. So Hanfstaengl actually mentions that Hitler loved the movie of King Kong. Like, of all things, Hitler loved King Kong. Very weird. And he even talked about it for days, right? I mean, for days he's talking about King Kong. Oh my God, that crazy monkey. So I actually had an idea as I was reading this little bit, because Hanfstaengl doesn't talk about this, but I wondered myself, is there some kind of psychological significance to Hitler's fascination with King Kong? Because you really have to wonder about the similarities between King Kong and himself, right? So we already talked about how Hitler was basically a neuter, couldn't have sex, couldn't be with a woman, couldn't father children. It's all pretty rough, right? I mean, that must have sucked. If anyone that is under those circumstances, I imagine is not easy. It's very difficult. And I think that there is some crossover between King Kong and Hitler himself. So King Kong is this very physically powerful, defiant monster, right? I mean, he can just kill people, destroy planes. I mean, all he's got to do is, swat his hand and bam, an entire crew of plane fighters, and they're all dead, gone, just like that. But he's trying to be with his love, right? I mean, he's holding this woman in his hand. He wants to love her, but he can't. Despite how physically powerful he is, how formidable he is, he cannot truly be with his love. And I think there's some similarity to how Hitler was. Hitler, I mean, maybe he loved Eva Braun. I don't know if Eva Braun, maybe just women in general, but Hitler couldn't be with them. And despite how high on that building that he climbed, how powerful he ever became, he couldn't be with a woman. It didn't matter if he was the most famous person in Germany, the best war hero, the highest political ranking, person in the entire country. Didn't matter. Because the world, those planes, were never going to let him be with a woman. So, I don't know. Make sure to leave a comment. I know this is one of those little weird bits, but I don't know. Am I onto something here? Maybe not. Let me know in the comment section if you guys have any thoughts, especially. I'm sure you guys are going to say some pretty crazy stuff. I'm looking forward to this comment section. Now, continuing with the story, Hitler started surrounding himself with yes men and radicals, and Hanfstaengl noted that these guys all had two characteristics in common, and that was that they were highly loyal. I mean, to a fault. Loyal to death. I mean, literally, some of these guys followed Hitler to the grave. I mean, Goebbels, and just some crazy stuff. And they were unambitious. So they were loyal to a fault, and they didn't really have any ambition to try to replace Hitler or, fulfill that role themselves. And all of these guys had this weird little thing they would do, where they would interrupt any voice of reason. So whenever someone outside of Hitler's little inner circle started talking to him, someone that might get him to see the light, make him see a little bit of reason, they would continue to interrupt, to kind of make excuses, to go, oh, Hitler, come do this, we got this thing for you, here's a newspaper, here, we got to take a picture, stuff like that. And Hanfstaengl noted how it was just a really weird dynamic, because he would be in there trying to talk to Hitler, and these weird little yes men would just keep coming over, and oh, here's a newspaper, and let's go do this, let's go get our pictures taken. Just constant interruption. And it was really their way of stopping anyone from being able to get any amount of reality into Hitler's mind. They didn't want anyone to influence him except for them. And despite all of these guys supposedly fighting on the same team, there was constant drama, there were constant quarrels between them, and Hanfstaengl called it basically a bunch of cats in a cage. They were just constantly at each other's throats, fighting. It wasn't complete chaos. There was some order, stuff did get done. But it was in a very negative, crazy, manipulative way. And again, it goes back to the Hitler's dynamic with his inner people and whatnot. And then Hanfstaengl puts things in a way that I just find so fascinating, because it's very powerful, very accurate, I think, where he says Hitler was no longer an idea distiller, but an idea bartender. Because let's not forget, Hitler did not really create any of the political ideas that were part of Nazism. He took stuff from nationalism, from fascism, from socialism, from Volkisch nationalism, pan-Germanism, right? All these different ideas from different political schools of thought, and he just kind of put it all into one big cocktail, and that was the Nazi ideology. At this point in the story, he's got the public drunk on their own cocktail, their own ideas that Hitler stole and regurgitated back at them in a way that now he was controlling the government. And it's around this point in his memoir that Hanfstaengl starts talking quite a bit about Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister of the Third Reich. He was a very close associate of Hitler. In fact, you can see some video clips where they're talking and kind of laughing, cracking jokes. I kind of get the vibe that they were good friends. Of course, they were technically, co-workers or party members or comrades, whatever you want to call it. But Goebbels was one of the psychologically ill men, one of the fanatics. And he had so many psychological problems. We're not going to get into every single one of them, but Hanfstaengl particularly disliked Goebbels. He called Goebbels, quote, the evil genius of the second half of Hitler's career. So he notices that Hitler is very much influenced by Goebbels, and he's just one of these crazy, evil, conniving little henchmen that comes around and silences any voice of reason and keeps Hitler on, the drunk on this, Nazi cocktail idea. And Goebbels is particularly interesting. We've done an entire biography piece on him. I don't think I was critical enough of him, after going through this memoir, but he had this massive inferiority complex because he had this crippled foot. And I've read quite a bit about how that would kind of impact you, how he couldn't be a soldier. He couldn't, there were a lot of things he couldn't do growing up, right? Especially as a young boy. You can't really play sports, can't be one of the guys. It just kind of sucks. And Hanfstaengl claims to have seen it once, which is wild because I don't think a lot of people actually have. I mean, Goebbels was very aware, very self-conscious about it. He hated the fact that his foot was messed up. And Hanfstaengl claimed that it looked like his foot was making a fist. In fact, he said something to the effect of he was an ideologically torn man because his foot was making the communist raised fist, and then his other foot was making the Nazi Sieg Heil salute. I found that to be a very interesting little bit right there. Hanfstaengl always putting in a little weird spin on things. But he really claims that Goebbels hated him because he said things how they were. Again, Hanfstaengl was probably, I'm sure he was drinking some of the Nazi Kool-Aid, some of the Nazi cocktail. I'm sure he was drinking some of it, but he wasn't completely drunk on it, at least not anywhere near as these other party members were. Again, this is part of the reason he was so isolated. And he actually called Goebbels Pierre. In a reference to Robespierre, the crazy, violent French revolutionary who, he was the guy that was the reason people were getting guillotined, their heads cut off. So Robespierre was this crazy, evil, violent guy. And then, oh, you're Goebbels Pierre. Yeah, and he literally claimed that, most of Goebbels, his own material came straight from Robespierre. It was like, just a couple steps away from straight up plagiarism, which is an interesting claim to make. We may explore that in a future episode, maybe a postscript episode, who knows. Let me know if you guys would be interested in that. And there is a really interesting dynamic playing out between Joseph Goebbels and his wife, Magda. So I believe originally Goebbels was a single guy for a long time. He obviously, if you're watching the video right now, you can see a picture of him. He's not the most handsome man in the world. And then you got he was kind of a smaller guy. He had this inferiority complex with his foot. He was not athletic, kind of a nerd. He probably had a hard time with women. And it's interesting because a lot of the other Nazis, they kind of recognize that, oh yeah, Goebbels is kind of struggling to, start a family here. So they kind of tried hooking him up. And the person he got hooked up with was this Magda, eventually became his wife. It was a very big to-do with that. But one of the crazier bits in their relationship actually has to do with how crazy Goebbels was himself. So there's this one story that Hanfstaengl tells about being at a private cinema showing at Goebbels' house. So, of course, by this point, they're all very big Nazi party officials, very well-to-do, big money now, right? Anyone that wins in politics is rich. And they're coming out of the private cinema. So they've just seen this movie, they're going down the steps, and Goebbels actually falls, right? His foot, it was just messed up. It was hard for him to walk. And Magda catches him. Just instinctively, right? That's what you do. Oh, hey, my husband's falling. Let me catch him so he doesn't, fall all the way down all these steps and die, or get a concussion. Well, after he recovers, he stands back up and he grips Magda by the neck, forces her down to her knees, and then he has this mad laughter about him, and he says this, quote, "So, you saved my life that time. That seems to please you a lot. I mean, Hanfstaengl claimed that it revealed the depth of his moral depravity, but oh my god. When I first read this story, I could literally not picture how awkward and how cringe it was because, he mentions all the people are still there. I mean, this happened in front of everyone. It wasn't just like Hanfstaengl was the only one there. There were like a bunch of people there. So it was like a bunch of high-ranking Nazi people, their wives, maybe even their kids. And they see Goebbels pull this this mad laughter. He's, hurting his wife, forcing her down. And then, he's, oh, you saved my life. I mean, what? That has to be one of the scariest and the craziest and the most revealing stories about Joseph Goebbels I've ever read or heard about. So time was going by, the Nazi Party was thriving, their power was increasing, they were getting better at what they did. And Hitler, he had a couple girlfriends here and there, never really hit it off with them. Again, he was, infertile or, a neuter, he couldn't get off, he couldn't have sex, whatever was wrong with him, it stopped him from having any long-lasting relationship until Eva Braun. And they got together and they had, good personality match. I mean, there's kind of this whole, sentiment with them where they did eventually get married right before they killed themselves. So there's that. But I don't know if Eva Braun was the forever girl for Hitler because she had some interesting complaints about him. One of them is not surprising because she claims that she was abused by Hitler, and spousal abuse is a very common thing. I imagine when someone is as nutty as Hitler is, it is almost expected, so there's that. But she had another complaint that might jog your memory from some other problems Hitler had when she complains, quote, "As it is, I have nothing from him as a man." Now that seems like some pretty damning evidence, right? I mean, here we have Hanfstaengl recording something that Eva Braun said, "I have nothing from him as a man." There's not a whole lot of interpretation there. I mean, right? Hitler is a neuter. So, there's that. So I just can only imagine that was a big tragedy there. But it was just a real struggle. It was a real struggle. Hitler, what do you even do? I mean, does he just, accept that he's going to be alone for his entire life? I mean, that... I just don't know what his plans were in that regard. I don't think even he did. I don't think he had any plans. He was just hoping that he was going to conquer the whole world and maybe he'll have a girlfriend and be able to have sex. Hopefully, maybe. The man who conquered the whole world to get laid. Still didn't get laid. But on a sadder note, Hanfstaengl's wife does divorce him in 1936. And this was rough because she had been very skeptical of Hitler a lot sooner than Hanfstaengl had been. He had his doubts from, I would say, the early 30s, but he had some doubts even before then. His wife was a little bit more skeptical pretty much from day one. And after a certain point, Hanfstaengl is gone all the time. He's doing these weird missions. He's part of this government that she doesn't really approve of. And things just had to end. So that was a big blow for Hanfstaengl. So now, my friends, we are finally to the beginning of the end. And that is this whole, this film situation, Benito Mussolini, and the big purge. So this is what the situation kind of looks like. So Hanfstaengl was working as a producer on a propaganda film. Again, he was from high society, so he was kind of privileged in his access and money and whatnot. And I guess he saw where the party was becoming so crazy, he just kind of wanted to be away from that whole environment. So he's doing this film. It's about the revolution in recent history, right? Because of course that's one of the first things you do, right? Try to write history, so it favors you. And they're out filming a fighting scene in a Berlin suburb. I don't remember the exact name, but the suburb was largely communist, and that was part of the reason so much fighting went on there. And it was still largely communist by this point in Nazi history. So it's like there's a big communist holdout. All these big ranking Nazis are there. There's, SS officers and police officers and people in costume and uniforms, all this crazy stuff. So the communists, they see all the Nazis coming out to do this propaganda film, and they just start beating the crap out of them. It must have been such a scene. And Hanfstaengl, being the absolute madman that he is, him and the other filming guys, they YOLO it, and they just start filming the real fighting. And he even says, this was some great footage. This was better footage than we ever could have acted. So it turned into a pretty good thing, at least according to Hanfstaengl. So the film ends up turning out really great. Now Joseph Goebbels sees it, and he gets it blocked from being shown because he's jealous. He doesn't want anyone else to be making really good stuff, especially, Hanfstaengl him and Goebbels butted heads quite a bit. He really doesn't like Goebbels, and, Goebbels does everything he can to block this film, which is really bad because it was very expensive to make. So Hanfstaengl is kind of stuck in this weird situation where he has spent quite a bit of government money, and he's got this film now that Goebbels doesn't want anyone to see. So that is the conundrum that Hanfstaengl finds himself in. So he tries to use it as an excuse to go see Benito Mussolini, the dictator of Italy, right? Il Duce. And he goes down there, but he also has an ulterior motive. You see, he's trying to talk Mussolini into meeting with Hitler, so he can sit Hitler down and kind of set him straight. Get him off of this drunken Nazi cocktail that Hitler's just been binge drinking for years now. And hopefully Hitler can begin to see reason. That was Hanfstaengl's hope. Again, the film thing, kind of secondary to him. I think that the film actually did working out. Mussolini was on board with that, and Hanfstaengl ended up making some money back from that for the government. But, really he wanted Hitler and Mussolini to meet. And Mussolini agrees. He sent a postcard or a picture back to address to Hitler. So Hanfstaengl comes back, and he explains the situation to Hitler. He's like, listen, man, I've got this arrangement for you. We can have a good ally. Things can be really good, especially because relations between the two countries were not very good at this point. History is always very weird because Mussolini and Hitler eventually fought on the same side in World War II, and we assume that it's largely because they were ideologically similar, right? They both very much adhered to fascism. Hitler had a little bit more stuff sprinkled in, but fundamentally they were both fascist states. And it wasn't necessarily inevitable for that to happen. In fact, Mussolini, there was a good chance that he ended up going into World War II on the side of the Allies because Hitler and Germany, they weren't very friendly for a good while. Hitler, he says he's open to it. Maybe at some other time, I'm very busy, very busy. He's always using that excuse. And then relations continued to deteriorate. Things got worse. Not good. Well, a couple weeks later, Hanfstaengl is invited to a Harvard reunion. And at this point, he's always got his eye on America. He's always going on, hey, Hitler, America is good. America is the future. We should be friendly with them. He's trying to go back to this Harvard reunion in the hopes of meeting with President Roosevelt and establishing a connection for Hitler, which would have been a big deal. And of course, when Hanfstaengl is back, he's in America. He's getting questioned by a whole bunch of different people about the Nazi regime. It was a big fiasco, right? You can go back and see some of the headlines in the newspapers talking about how there's going to be a Nazi, at the Harvard reunion, right? It was a big deal, very big to do. And while he's over here in America, Hitler actually meets with Mussolini behind Hanfstaengl's back, which must have felt pretty close to a betrayal, especially because Hanfstaengl wanted to be there so he could guide the conversation to an extent, right? Because there's always a chance that when someone like Mussolini talks to Hitler and tries to get them to see reason, there's always that possibility that Hitler reacts negatively. And that would have been very, very bad for Germany. Just imagine, they had him and Mussolini butt heads. They have completely opposite personalities. They clash. And then, lo and behold, Italy is on the side of the Allies in World War II. Totally could have happened. And it's actually while Hanfstaengl is in the United States that the first big purge happens. And I believe this was the Night of the Long Knives when the Strasser brothers and the left-leaning faction and a whole bunch of conservative German politicians, they just got completely purged, murdered, slaughtered, done away with. And they're not a problem anymore. The voices of some of them were, voices of reason, right? So Hanfstaengl was completely caught off guard. He had no idea this was coming. And a lot of people in America questioned him about it. So again, there's this very bitter feeling that Hanfstaengl gets where, he's a high-ranking guy in this government, and here the government is doing stuff that he has no idea about. Foreigners in America, journalists are asking him, hey, can you comment on this? You're a Nazi, you're in this government. Can you tell us what's going on here? And he's like, hopefully it's a mistake. He was just completely caught off guard. Again, it must have been so frustrating to have been Hanfstaengl throughout this entire situation. Now, there was one point when he actually talks to an old friend from Harvard. He asks about National Socialism, right? Tell me what is this ideology, right? Because I see it, I think it's kind of nuts, but maybe I can hear it from you. We're old friends. Maybe I can see reason on this. So Hanfstaengl writes, quote, "If a car gets stuck in the mud and begins to sink deeper and deeper, and the engine stops, and then a man comes along and pours something into the works which starts it up again, you don't ask what it was he put in. You set to and get the damn thing out." And then his friend replied, quote, "But what happens when the driver gets drunk on it?" And this was a bittersweet moment of realization for Hanfstaengl. Because he says this was one of the moments that kind of got him to see the light, that all hope was lost. The driver was drunk on it. Hitler was completely drunk on this Nazi cocktail that he had been feeding back to the people, and he had constantly reinforced to him by his own inner circle, these fanatics, and it was just not going to get better. It's not going to get better. And I imagine it must have been so frustrating. This has been a big part of Hanfstaengl's life for years by this point. How many? Probably thousands of US dollars in terms of, the amount he's put into this to fund it, and all the support and all the work he's done. He's held positions in this government. And it's completely lost. It's controlled by a crazy drunken fool. And he's going to destroy the nation in the process. So there's this big, terrible purge. Hanfstaengl goes back to Germany. He wants answers. He goes and he meets Hitler and Goebbels to kind of catch up with them. They're staying at a resort in northern Germany near the sea. He goes up and he sees them. "Hey guys, what's up? How you doing? What's the update?" Hitler glares at him and he says, quote, "There you are. Haven't they done you in yet?" A massive party purge just happened. He sees Hanfstaengl, and the first thing Hitler says is, "Haven't they done you in yet?" I can't even imagine. That must have been terrifying. And Hanfstaengl, of course, this was a very serious and life-changing moment for him right then and there. So I'm just going to quote to you a good paragraph from this little section. Hanfstaengl writes, quote, "I really think I got black spots before the eyes. There was the mister, too, a deliberately offensive reference to my Anglo-Saxon outlook. It was one of those moments when the impressions of a lifetime flash across one's inner mind like a sped-up film. I suddenly saw a picture of his untidy little flat in the Tierkstrasse and the haggard-looking orator of genius who stood there in the hall, hungry for the beauties and success of life. The long years in between dissolved again into the livid face in front of me. I realized it was a contorted face of a murderer defiantly at bay, a pathological murderer who had tasted blood and acquired an appetite for more. Through the window came the vague and familiar sounds of a seaside resort. I pulled myself together with a shudder. What does one answer in such circumstances?" What does one answer in such circumstances? Hanfstaengl never gets an answer on what happened with the Purge, why it took place, who exactly was even killed. I mean, for a long time, people didn't even know how many people died. Who exactly was killed? I mean, you just don't know these things. No clear answer ever came. And Hanfstaengl says that this was the parting of the ways. That he could have forgiven the other flaws up until this point, but there was a real feeling that he got that he was supposed to have been done in. He was also supposed to be purged. But he was in America. He lucked out. I just can't imagine how scary that must have been. I mean, that must be terrifying. Imagine the person that controls your country looks at you and says, right after a purge, and says, "Haven't they done you in yet?" That's wild. This memoir has been such a roller coaster, man. And then he starts talking a little bit about the psychology of Hitler. And he talks about beliefs and obsessions, and how even false ones can foster superhuman energy. But they also destroy your judgment at the same time. And he thinks that is what happened with Hitler. He was completely intoxicated on the Nazi cocktail. Drunk on power. Drunk on that cocktail. And he had superhuman energy while he was doing it, but he had no judgment anymore. No more moral compass. His internal moral compass became the party line. And it was a sad realization, because what do you do now? All right, Hanfstaengl, he's been working in this government now, helped the party come to power. Now they're in power, and it was a sad realization, because what do you do now? All right, Hanfstaengl, he's been working in this government now, helped the party come to power. Now they're in power, and he realizes that they're gangsters, psychotics, crazy, evil people, terrible people. And well, what do you do? What do you do? What do the Germans do? I mean, this isn't just him. I mean, there are plenty of otherwise good people that are in this country. What do? They can't all abandon their lives and leave. And it was a really difficult situation. They just kind of had to live through it. He says something really fascinating. Hanfstaengl writes, quote, "The tragedy of an orator became the tragedy of his listeners. The German people who had heard Hitler speak were about to live through some very tough times." They had a big mission for Hanfstaengl that eventually turned into his final mission, because it officially pushed him over the edge. He couldn't take any more after this. So what happened? So 1936, the Spanish Civil War is going on. There's Francisco Franco leading the fascists and the right-wingers. And they are fighting the communists and the Republicans. So it's this very standard left versus right civil war going on. The Spanish Civil War it was basically a testing ground for the modern militaries of Europe. The UK, They were sending a whole bunch of volunteers. Germany was sending in reinforcements. I mean, it was basically a proxy war. People wanted to see how their military tactics and their soldiers would play out in a real-life war scenario. And of course, none of them wanted a real war. I mean, right then. So they were like, okay, we're going to have this little, test war. And that's what the Spanish Civil War basically turned into. Now, some Nazis, they come to Hanfstaengl's house and they're like, listen, man, we've got this really important mission for you. We got to take you right now. You got to go like tonight. I mean, this is a big deal. We're sending you off. So he goes from his house to go to Spain. It's supposed to be for diplomatic reasons. He doesn't question it. I guess they just rushed him into it so fast that, he just kind of had to go along. He doesn't speak any Spanish. So it was kind of a weird scenario, but he went along with it. And as he gets into the plane, they're taking off, and the pilot tells him that they are dropping him off between Barcelona and Madrid, which is communist territory. So that was bad. That was bad, and he knew full well that it wasn't going to be long before he was A, recognized, and B, murdered. So he realized that he's going to get killed. And he started freaking out. I mean, I just can only imagine the panic. And the entire time, there's this other guy on the plane named Jaworski who just keeps taking pictures and videos of Hanfstaengl. He claimed to be, going there for, journalistic reasons or whatever, to record the scene on the ground, what was going on. And he's just sitting there wasting all the film on Hanfstaengl, who's in this plane, who just found out he's probably going to get killed. And he's freaking out, and it's just this crazy dumpster fire. Well, lo and behold, the plane had a problem, and they had to stop. So they eventually land, and Hanfstaengl, at this point, he's like, screw it. He's getting out. He's done with this Nazi stuff. He's lost his wife. He's lost, any amount of self-respect this guy had at any point. And what has he got to lose at this point? I mean, his life, right? And he wants a chance at redemption. So he escapes from Germany. He goes to Switzerland. He gets his son to the United States. And then he eventually makes his way to the UK. And, it was just a big to-do. Even when he was in the United Kingdom, Hermann Göring's writing him all these letters. And he's saying, listen, my old friend, come back to Germany. Come back. We need you. And it was a weird situation because they claimed Hermann Göring and the higher-ups in the Nazi party, they didn't like something that Hanfstaengl had said. So they organized this whole little thing. They weren't trying to kill him. It was supposed to be a joke. The plane was supposed to have a problem, and they landed somewhere, and that was going to be that. They never had any real intention of dropping him into communist territory and getting him killed. That's not what they wanted. Hanfstaengl didn't buy it, and he didn't go back. And I can't blame him, because by that point I would have been terrified. Pretty wild stuff. And what's even worse, this Jaworski guy who had been taking all these pictures and videos of Hanfstaengl, he was undercover, he was in on the whole thing. And he goes back to the higher-ups with the footage, and they all laughed at it. They were like laughing at this guy who thought he was going to get killed. Just how sick is that? What kind of people were these? This was supposed to be one of their own. This isn't some random Jew, or this isn't some random Slav from the streets. This is one of their own high-ranking Nazis that thinks he's gonna get killed by his comrades. And here they are, sitting around, laughing and jeering at his suffering. So that tells you really all you need to know about these guys. Hanfstaengl eventually gets interned during World War II. They were not sure if he was going to defect. I can't really blame the Western governments. But he does end up working for the United States. and he works on the project, the psychological analysis of Hitler, where he makes really massive contributions. He really does everything he can to help the Western powers, and it was really a good thing. And it turned out to be the right move, because later on there was a document discovered after World War II, and it was a list of people who were to be liquidated, a euphemism for killed, right? So when you said liquidated, they were coming to kill you. And he was one of these people that was going to be liquidated when the Nazis invaded the UK. So they had every intention of killing him, even though they were going to BS him. Oh, old friend, come on back to Germany. We need you. We love you. It was just a joke. It was just a prank, bro. It was not just a prank. They were going to kill him one way or the other. So he made the right move. I'm glad he ended up working for the US and then getting to write this memoir, because it is just so fascinating. The Nazis had actually pulled the first big "it's just a prank, bro" in history, right? Especially, they had the video component of it. I don't know about you guys. When I finish recording this, I am definitely going to go online and see if this footage is available anywhere. "It's just a prank, bro," said Hitler. So Hanfstaengl, despite having been a really big supporter of the Nazi Party, someone who funded it from the beginning, someone who was one of the reasons they got to power in the first place, despite being that he eventually got his freedom, he did work for the Allies, in the important part of the war. He made a good, positive difference at that point. And then he wrote this memoir, which really sheds a lot of light. He ends it with a really beautiful quote. Hanfstaengl writes, quote, "My one desire is to live long enough to see a Germany, and indeed a world, where Hitlers are no longer possible." I'm not sure that time is ever going to come, but we can hope. We can all hope. His son, Egon, who had actually been his security guard while he was interned and working for the United States, he actually wrote the afterword in the memoir. And he says that his father spent the rest of his life lacerating himself over the part that he had played, second-guessing himself, wondering why. Why did he let it go so far? Why did he just turn his brain off and refuse to see the terrible reality that was in front of him all along? But I do think that he did good. He made his mistakes. He definitely was partly responsible for the terrible things that happened in the Third Reich and all the chaos that it unleashed and all the suffering and the misery. There's no denying that. But he saw the light eventually. He saw the light eventually, and he worked and he helped the Allies. He was at least fighting on the right side. He fought on the right side, and that's a lot more than you can say about any of the other Nazis. Because the rest of them, they just continued. They never came. They never stopped being drunk on the Nazi cocktail. They never stopped. Some of them followed Hitler to the grave. So the fact that at least one eventually saw the light, it kind of shows that there is hope. There's always hope. No matter how bad things may seem, there's a little bit of hope. I really hope you guys enjoyed the episode. Make sure to leave a comment, any of your thoughts, any ideas you have for future episodes. This has been History for Thinkers. Thank you so much. I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.